How's all with you? All good, yeah?
Yeah, it's just been pretty manic. I was just so exhausted. I have to tell you, I'm just so I don't know what it is. It's funny. I mean, I think spring is in the air and you sort of think, oh, great, I'm full of energy. The sun's coming up again. It's going to be nice. Actually, I feel as if I need to start hibernating. Do you know what I mean? It's just a bit weird. I mean, I really we should be waking up from hibernation, and yet there's me sort of going, oh.
Is it work?
Anyway.
Are you just work, is it? Just stress at work, is it?
It is. I mean, it's 4 weeks left of teaching, so I'm not going to complain.
All right.
And but there's been a lot going on, with Iran and stuff, so that's been quite interesting. And we can talk a bit about the elections actually, if you want.
Yeah, I got your
Uh,
lovely first off, your lovely book that I have
well, it's
here.
very kind of you, I
That
have
I
to say.
have here. Look at
Look
this.
at
I'm
that. Look at
just
that.
beautiful. I love the cover. The cover is
Well, I
amazing.
have to say, I'm very pleased with the cover. I would never normally judge a book by its cover, but I do like this cover, and I think it's the first time actually that publishers actually listened to me. So.
Okay.
I'm quite pleased with that. I mean, I think they did a fine job. They did a fine job with the production, actually, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a great
Um,
book. It's a great book. I
well,
loved it.
it's very kind. I mean, I find with these things, to be honest, that it's more difficult
Mm.
to write a sort of a short book because and you'll notice there's not many references in it, so it's very light on the footnoting and stuff. And it basically is it's intended for a much more sort of a larger audience, a more popular audience. But I mean, I have to say, this and the other book I did for OUP on the very short introduction, Iran, a very short introduction, which
Mm.
is even shorter, I have to say. They're very difficult books to write actually in a curious sort of way because you have to summarize, you have to sort of basically abridge everything you know.
Okay. So you have to kind of limit your kind of
40,
knowledge. You did
45,000 words. I mean, the other one was 30,000 words. And they're merciless when you
right.
get to the limit. Yeah, yeah.
Wow. So do you find like you're editing yourself like the whole way through because you're like, well, I can't put all everything you want to say. You kind of have to make
Well, the thing
everything
is, as
compact.
my poor long-suffering editor will tell you, I mean, basically you submit a draft,
Mm.
and the draft is rarely good enough. I mean, long gone are the days when I could sort of write, without having to, correct it and stuff. But the thing is with shorter books like this, you end up having to redraft it, because
Right.
what you're trying to do is to, pitch at the right level, get the right amount of information in without oversimplifying it. Do you see what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a lot in
Um,
it though. Like I seriously, I mean, I would need to read that again. I mean, I'm very
no, that's
stupid.
very kind.
I'm
Well, I mean,
stupid.
I'm glad you found it. I mean, I have to say, I must give a shout out to my copy editor actually, who was superb,
Yeah.
and she was what I call a very user friendly
Okay.
editor who basically caught out some really sort of daft comments and daft turns of phrase actually because you end up writing this thing and you're so lost in it
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
that you look at something. Then I remember looking at one of these things again. She says, what do you mean by this? I looked at it and I thought, I'm not sure actually. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you sort of think,
Yeah.
oh, bloody hell, did I write that? Oh
Yeah.
no, it's terrible. The grammar's all wrong.
Sometimes you can appreciate though a kind of another voice. It's like, when I do music, I mix and do everything myself and then I give it to a mastering engineer. Now I could master it
Ah,
myself,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah,
just
yeah,
that
yeah.
last kind of you can actually appreciate it, I think. Whereas if
So when you're
everything,
when you're writing music, by the way, I mean, how do
yeah,
you your process of sort of writing? I mean,
I
obviously you must
just
go through various revisions and iterations and drafts.
s-
Yeah.
well, more so kind of as I got older, more so kind of going, okay, well, I could add more of an interesting chord there than just do a normal generic kind of thing, and trying to, and then you can kind of take you on somewhere else that's quite interesting, like certain chords, because like, I mean, modern chords always use very major chords and stuff like that, and there's a four chord of every song nowadays. It's a typical like,
Well,
you
they
know.
say that, don't they? I mean, you're talking to a complete ignoramus here, but I have heard about this that all these modern sort of songs, pop songs in particular, have a
Mm.
certain they follow a certain pattern, don't they? And
Yeah, whereas if you compare to like songs from the 60s, 70s, even further back, there's a complexity even in the pop music,
oh, is
obviously the
that right?
Beatles. Yeah, 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 like
Oh, I
Brian
didn't
Wilson
know
and the
that. I
Beach
thought
Boys.
all sort of modern. I thought all sort of basically from the birth of rock and roll onwards. They will
No,
follow me.
no, no. A lot of Beach Boys songs, like Brian Wilson does, is has wrote some amazing like songs, like the way
Wow, that's interesting.
yeah, some of his changes, like on a song called "This Whole World," he just his modulation is incredible, like So there's this. It's quite. I'll send you a video afterwards on Brian Wilson because he's just a pop master in terms of like like you hear it and you're like, that's kind of simple, and then you would
Yeah,
deconstruct
yeah.
and you're like, actually, there's layers to it and just the harmonies and everything like that. So. Yeah. I think that's the thing of modern life though. Everything's becoming more kind of dumbed down from like the food we
Yeah.
eat to the music to the films to like even our political the way we get political news. Everything seems to be kind of being dumbing
It's all
down.
very shorthand, you see. And I mean, this is the
Mm.
thing. And we were talking about this actually recently at university about how you do public history. And public history is basically an element of trying to, basically disseminate, a lifetime's knowledge or your research to a much more sort of a general audience. And of course, one of the problems we have with this is often to get someone's attention, as
Mm.
you imagine, you often have to use either simplifications or slightly racy language or something. You know, I mean, I used to remember a long time ago. Actually, it was I tell you, the newspaper in this country is famous for this sort of thing, and clickbait is obviously the Sun. The
Which one is
Sun,
that? Oh God, yeah, the lovely
and the
sun.
Sun used to be very. And I remember talking to a very lovely guy actually. He was a Sun journalist actually. And he said to me, and he used to go to Iran, and he was very keen. And he said, "Oh, I used to in my youth, I used to write for the Sun." And I said, "Oh, yeah." And he said, "Of course, what the Sun taught you is how to." So he was laying claim actually to. I don't know if he did it, but he certainly used it a lot about mad mullahs do blah blah blah. And it was always mad mullahs. You could never put mullah without mad mullah does this or
Right.
mad
To
mullah.
catch the
And
attention.
I thought it was quite interesting because he was basically saying, it had become a trope, and it had become a sort of almost like what we'd call it now, a meme. I don't know, but it was it just became standard practice. I mean, nobody actually thought about it anymore. But
Right.
but it was good clickbait, and if you could add some sort of sexualized story to it, even better. Mad
Uh,
Muller caught naked in blah blah.
okay.
Uh, then suddenly people would read it.
Yeah, but I
Now the
think
story
it's like
itself might be
yeah.
more interesting.
Yeah, but I think all kind of newspapers have become like. I mean, I don't know. I don't know your views on the Guardian, but what the Guardian has become the last few, I'm like, what is that? Like, it's
Oh, I
kind
know.
of,
I mean, definitely. I think I share your
jeez.
despair.
When I
I
grew
do
up,
share your
when I
despair
grew
on
up,
that because they do come out and they often come out with some. I mean, the pity is that you always tend to expect a higher standard from the Guardian.
yeah, that's it.
In
Yeah,
the same way as the New York Times, by the way, the New York Times has gone completely sort of back to
they've
particularly
gone
on its
mad too.
stories on Britain. Actually, its stories on Britain, particularly post Brexit Britain, have become a bit of a parody. Actually, they sort of like. I mean, I know things aren't great in some ways, but it's not that everyone's eating boiled mutton or something. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
they would sort of say this sort of stuff. Um, dare I say, slightly Fintan O'Toole. But there you are.
Oh, so he's definitely a tool. That's all I know. The world's becoming very. In my time, I think it's probably the most fractured time the world's been.
I
I
agree with
think.
you, actually. I really agree with you. I think we live in very precarious times.
You know.
And it's interesting. I think we all need to step up to the plate, and um, I mean, even here, I mean, I don't think people are doing way enough here, to be honest. But I think the whole of Europe needs to, particularly looking forward to the US elections, we have to be quite alert to what the implications of a Trump presidency will be. Not that it's certain he'll win, but I mean, he's looking quite robust at the moment, is all I'd say.
I think he'll definitely win. I
Yeah.
think they're doing.
Well,
They're not doing the case by trying to. You can't just take a guy off a ballot and say that's democracy. Whether you like him or don't like him, you just that's you.
I mean, this is the thing. It's helping him. Yeah, it's certainly helping him
Yeah, you know.
build a
Mm.
almost build a sympathetic support base, isn't it? Because some people
Yeah.
are backing him simply out of protesting, the way they've tried to
Yes.
do.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of like I don't know. It's just the world is just. I just find it so odd. Like, and there's a strange alliance I find between the left and radical Islam. There's like this strange alliance that's gone on in the last few years where you look at those.
Well, there
Not
is. I
saying,
mean, it's basically because it all merges in this sort of post-colonial narrative, and they both share this sort of anti-imperial. Uh,
Anti-West kind
and
of.
that's why you're getting this sort of like, I mean, it's not entirely illogical, I suppose, from one level, but the sort of Sinn Féin support for Hamas or whatever it is. I mean, I don't know, presumably they say it's for Palestinian liberation, or whatever, but I think they have been, there has been some curious bedfellows, hasn't there? I mean, there's been some odd
Yeah,
ones.
yeah. Sinn Féin are losing a lot of support over here,
I
for
mean,
sure.
presumably Sinn Féin aren't, I mean, they're not particularly religious anymore, are they? They used to be quite,
No,
am I
no,
right or wrong?
no, they're not. They're not. I think
They're
it's
not anymore.
just. I don't even know what Sinn Féin are anymore. Because Sinn
Oh,
Féin kind
really?
of. Yeah, they've posed themselves as this kind of nationalistic party. But then on what a big thing of nationalism nowadays is immigration. They're completely on the government side of it. And it's like, hey, come on. You
That's very
can't.
interesting. I mean, I was very
Yeah.
interested to see that you guys have a similar debate really about immigration and what's going on. And of course, your capacity to absorb immigrants
Oh,
is obviously much smaller. I used to remember talking to
oh
Swedish
yeah.
delegates, because the Swedes always had a very open door policy, actually, and a very liberal policy on immigration. But it was starting to have a bit of a knock on effect on them because their capacity, I think the population of Sweden is about 8 million.
Yeah.
There were clearly, frictions emerging. Um, it's true. It's a really difficult one to.
Well,
It's a
well,
really difficult one to navigate, isn't it?
I've had politicians on my podcast, and they they always love to say, which I totally answer them back on it. But they always love to say, but you have to understand, Ireland, pre-famine had 8 million people,
Eight
and
million. You know.
I'm like, yeah, but we didn't have schools and hospitals and all this. You can't equate that. Or they'll go, you must remember the Irish went abroad. It's like, yeah, but we didn't get free medical cards and like a place to live, and like all these kind of things that are
I mean,
modern day things.
I think you're right to say actually that obviously the biggest difference now is this sort of existence of a welfare state,
Yeah.
and
Oh, we're definitely that.
immigration or emigration has almost nothing to. I mean, I was thinking about it. I mean, even if those immigrants who went over to the United States in the 19th century or early 20th century, I mean, they basically had to make their own way. I mean, the one
Yeah.
thing there was space, obviously.
Mm.
There's still vast amounts of space, to be honest, in North America. I mean, you
Yeah, a
can't get
lot there.
lots of room. But the trick is obviously now it's really because the nature of the state has changed, and the
Mm.
state offers you all sorts of different sort of amenities from, let's say, healthcare or whatever, housing and other things. That it now becomes basically a matter for economic planning, and unless you can plan it, it just doesn't work. I mean, it's
Yeah.
potentially it's going to cause a lot of friction.
Yeah, especially when it's happening. I think the difference between other places with regards to Ireland, because we're so small, now every village over the last 2 years where we had none asylum seekers, we have loads. So it went from
It's very
having
interesting.
zero
Yeah, I had
to
no idea that.
loads.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's kind of like, even if you try and logically have a conversation with someone, it's always like, oh, well, you're just far right. You're like, oh, dude, can we not just.
I mean, this is the issue, of course, is they shut down conversation
Yeah.
about it. And sometimes you just need to have a sensible conversation about it. And
Mm,
and obviously you don't want to go down. I mean, this is the problem, is that it just then allows those who are on the far right, I think, and those who are willing to be obnoxious about things, just to make shocking comments. It's not a
mm.
discussion really at all, is it? Because they just go
No,
to the other extreme,
no, no.
Um,
Actually, I meant to ask you, what did you think of Rishi Sunak's address after George Galloway won?
Personally, I think it was a bit overdone. I mean, I think it was a bit over egged.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because when you come and do, I'll tell you why. I think when you come and do an address outside Downing Street with the podium and everything, everyone expects, something really quite momentous to happen. And of
Mm.
course, the momentous thing that happened, I presume, was George Galloway got elected to Rochdale. And I mean, I thought it sort of gave Galloway a bit more credit or authenticity or attention than he deserved,
Which he
And
wants.
I think that there is a conversation to be had about this. I don't think there's any doubt about it. That there are parts of the community in Britain, particularly the Jewish community. Let's be honest about it, who feel very, very unsafe in some ways.
Mm. Mm.
But I just think the way in which he did it, getting a podium outside number 10, was, I mean, you could have done it in a different way. You could have addressed it in a different way. It gave it a sense of importance,
Okay, yeah.
and certainly Galloway's election that I don't think Galloway really deserves. And my own view is that Galloway will, obviously Galloway said it's tectonic, didn't he? So there was a tectonic shift and all this. Let's see. I'm not convinced, actually. I'm just not convinced.
Yeah.
Galloway's a great performer,
Oh, he's
um,
an orator for sure. He
very
can speak.
theatrical. But as you say, he's not. His admiration for Saddam Hussein is well known. So
Yes. I've seen that video. Yeah. I love the way he tried to say, "Oh, I didn't say that. I meant the people." Like, bro, you literally said it to
I
him. It
don't know.
was,
You didn't
yeah,
know.
you
You
lit.
literally saluted the. I
Yeah.
can't even say the word. Kind of was it indefatigable? Whatever, indefatigability or whatever. So but he saluted him. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember it. Watching it.
Mm. Mm.
So it's. I
Interesting
mean,
times.
but that is, as you say, this sort of post-colonial radical leftist narrative that tends to see anyone who is opposed to the West as
Mm.
good. Yeah,
But
whereas I would say to people, they can both be bad. I mean,
yeah, 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 yeah. But I don't. What?
it's not a zero-sum game.
But what I don't get about the radical left is that they don't the radical Islam is far right. Like, I mean, the radical left despise the far right, but you're aligning yourself with the far right. Like, radical Islam is far right. Like, it
Well,
hates everything.
it's a bit like saying why did the Nazis get into a pact with the Soviets?
That's
One was
true.
meant to be radical right, one was meant to be radical left.
That's
But
true.
I've always viewed these things as a sort of a circle, and they go so far, 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 out, and then they meet back.
Yeah, it's a
I
good
mean, that's
point.
basically,
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
so far, 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 far. Oh, look,
yeah.
the
They
same
go
country.
so far right, they get to the left.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the way I see it. I mean, it's quite interesting, and so
Mm,
there are many aspects of radical Islam that and radical Islamists that can be seen as very sort of um, socialistic, if I can put it that term. They're very sort of
okay.
in terms of the community. Do you know what I mean? It's
Mm-hmm.
all about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think what it is with them is that there are areas of convergence and areas in which they see eye to eye. But you're quite right. It's we used to in Iran, for instance, in the revolution, and they still exist. There was a group known as the Mujahideen Khalq who basically espoused a sort of view of Islamic Marxism.
Mm.
And people always say this is a contradiction in terms, isn't it? I mean, you can't be atheistic and religious at the same time. But of
Yeah,
course, what they're talking about, it's not as illogical in some ways as people say, because they do share um, certain certain perspectives. I mean, they do share certain perspectives, albeit coming from a different source, but nonetheless, it's about
yeah.
community control, um, uh, the loss of individual rights, that sort of thing, because
Mm.
it's a community that comes first.
Mm. You,
You see
you
what I
know
mean?
what was interesting in the book was that the West always called Iran Persia. I was
Yeah, that's right.
I never knew that. I was like, because Persia sounds really cool. I
Well, I
was
mean,
like, that's kind of a
I
cool
tell you
name.
the thing that I found very. So I put something in the book, it's like an urban myth, but it's not an urban myth actually. But I was that the last newspaper to stop calling Iran Persia was the Daily Telegraph, and then when the Shah left the country on the 16th of January 1978, um, was it what am I talking about? 79. Beg your pardon. God,
79.
even I'm in the plot here. 1979. Yeah, it's a brain fog. So 16th of January 1979. Um, because the revolution technically starts on the 8th of January 1978, which is that is an urban myth. No.
Yeah.
Anyway, so when the Shah leaves, suddenly the Telegraph, believe it or not, on the pages switches from using Persia, and the next day they use Iran. And I always thought, God, this is too good to be true. Anyway, I went to check, and it's absolutely true. That's exactly what they did.
That's crazy.
Um, and there's no explanation for it. They just do it. So, and of course, Persia. was, the classical European name for the country, and it's derived from Roman and
Hmm.
Latin, I beg your pardon, Latin and then Greek, and basically refers to the oldest province in the country, Pars, or
Hmm.
Persia. But the Iranians have always called the Iranians, certainly for several hundred years at the very, very least, have always called the country Iran. Um, and Iran as a cognate term, as a term identifying that plateau, has really been in use on and off really since late antiquity. I mean, really since the last of the pre-Islamic
Mm.
Persian empires. So it's been there. And of course, one of the big mistakes you find in a lot of textbooks, and they still repeat it, is that in 1934, the Iranians, or Reza Shah at the time, the king at the time, decided to change the name of his country from Persia to Iran. It's
Yeah.
completely untrue. I mean,
That's what I
what
always.
he
That's what
basically
I always
saying,
thought.
yeah, no, what he basically said is, he said, I'd quite like it if you called the country by the name we call it. I mean, that's all.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it caused a huge amount of um, I wouldn't say controversy, but there was, a bit of a concern that, the idea was that he wanted Iran to be used because he felt Persia and the Western sort of mindset and imagination sort of reeked of decadence and decay and all this sort of thing, and Iran would be nice and modern and forward looking. But of course, the irony is, as we go forward, whenever you mention Iran now, people think, oh no, yes, I think mad mullahs. Oh, they, whereas if I say Persia to you, you'll sort of say, oh, wonderful, great carpets, caviar,
Yes. Yes.
hats.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's funny how these word associations work, you see. And I mean,
Yeah.
the original intention was for Iran to be this sort of much more progressive and modern conception. I mean,
Hmm.
interestingly, Churchill always insisted on using the word Persia because he interestingly uh, noted that people constantly confused Iran and Iraq. So,
Mm.
because
Okay.
there'd be the odd typo or something. And he
Yeah.
said, to avoid any mistakes like this, let's just stick to Persia. And I think on that front, I mean, I have no objection, by the way. I mean, I think it's perfectly legitimate. Just as we don't go around talking about Deutschland, we talk about Germany, you know. Um, I mean, for goodness sake, many people in the world call Britain, Angleterre, or
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
England, or, So I mean, it's not, what a foreigner calls your country is up to them, I say.
Mm.
Um, I mean, obviously, if it's not rude, but it's a bit like Turkey has decided that everyone has to call the country Turkey. I mean,
Are they actually pushing that?
yeah, they've done it. It's done it.
Turkey's weirdly starting to go less secular. I've noticed. Like they
Yeah, I know.
seem to
I
be
mean, he's
going
moving
that
more into
path.
yeah, yeah. I mean, interestingly, Erdogan is moving more into a religious bent.
Yeah.
Um, and the Iranians, I mean, the Iranians are the most interesting in this respect, because the Iranian society is moving very heavily in a secular route.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not the state, not the state. The state is stuck in this rut, I have to say. And we've seen recently in the recent quote elections, and I put that in inverted commas for any of your
Hmm.
listeners, straight viewers, as well. Basically, it's been found out that the vast majority of the population boycotted the elections and did so very effectively. I have to say. I mean, I was quite impressed by the social cohesion on offer here.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, they just rejected it. And I always say to people, I say the secularization of Iranians is not about lacking religiosity. Many of
Yeah.
them will remain very religious. What they don't want is the state, for religion to dominate the state. That's what
Hmm.
they want a separation of church and state.
Yeah. Do you think since the last time we've talked, has much changed? Because it seems every time seems to be some little. You have to go looking for it. I mean, the news aren't really
Well,
showing much
I,
about Iran.
I think since the last time we talked, there hasn't been a huge amount on the surface. I
Yeah.
think there's been quite a bit under the surface. And I,
Mm.
I, I think this is always the problem. The problem is people, you need to know where to look. And one of the gratifying things for me has been that I was always arguing, as you know, that this sort of protests that had happened last year have not really subsided. They're still, simmering away,
Mm.
and it won't take much for things to spark off again. Um, but what I found quite interesting about this election boycott is it was, in some ways, a very, very interesting protest because it was effectively a boycott. It was non-violent, you know.
Mm.
There was no violence on either side, so the state didn't really have an option to repress anyone. The state has been very violent over the last year, by the way. I mean, one of the shocking statistics of the last year is I think the state has executed 834 people. I mean, it's
Jesus.
a lot, when you think of it. I think Iran now has per capita the highest executions of any country in the world. Per
Wow.
capita. I mean, China has it in absolute terms. But I think 3,000 people were executed in China last year out of a population of 1.2 billion or whatever it is. Um, but Iran, with a population of 90 million, has executed 834. So the violence is there, but it hasn't
Mm.
been meted out on the streets, and the people have decided to take their protest in a slightly different direction. And the other side of it, of course, is that the economy is tanking. I mean, whether we like it
Yeah.
or not, it's tanking. The currency is in not good shape. So it's what we're watching, as far as I'm concerned, is a sort of at the moment, is a sort of a death by a thousand cuts, which is
Yeah.
a slow, painful process of decay and decline, but one that could tip over at any stage. Now, the best case scenario is some wit and wise person at the high in the Iranian hierarchy suddenly realizes that they can't go on like this,
Hmm.
and something needs to change. The problem is that the sort of things that need to change would basically signal the end of the Islamic Republic as we know it. I mean, it just can't function this way. So it's they're facing a very, very interesting dilemma at the moment. I
But they
mean,
have to,
largely of their own making.
yeah. But they have to know it can't really last. Theocracies can't, modern day, they don't work like they used to, we'll say, 100. They can't really last. You can't have uh, live in your country like a theocracy because there's just too many rules put in. So your economy can't really grow and stuff like that.
I mean that's true. I mean, but I think that the situation in Iran is made worse by the fact that it's not just really just a theocracy; it's a sort of an absolute theocracy, if I can put it that
I
way.
get you. I get
Now,
you.
I ought to explain and unpack that because I think even friends of mine who work on religious studies would get very upset if I said. But my point is that the the um, the ruler, the supreme leader, um, this sort of religious, this Ayatollah, has no, technically in any way, and constitutionally has no restrictions on his power. So, what you're seeing is a system in which the rule of law is not paramount. I mean, and by the rule of law, I don't mean that there are no systems or no regulations that basically guide or discipline society and so on. But there are, the senior elements of the state
Mm.
have no legal obligation on them. There's no restrictions on them.
Mm.
And although they would say, well, there are restrictions on him because there are restrictions of Islamic law. The question is, who interprets that Islamic law?
Right.
Who interprets God's law? You know, and funnily enough, it's the supreme leader himself. I mean, now. I mean,
Shocking.
he obviously can't do it willy nilly in that sense,
Mm.
but depends on his route. But on the other hand, he has a tremendous amount of latitude to do what he wants, and I think the power of the supreme leader in Iran today far exceeds anything the Shahs in the last 200 years could aspire to. They didn't have this sort of authority and power to do things.
Mm.
Not only the authority of the religious authority of a sort of sacred figure in that sense, but the power to do it in terms of the tools of a modern state to be able
Yeah.
to sort of implement sort of things there. So you have a sort of a medieval system of government empowered by the tools of a modern state.
Yeah.
And this makes for a very, very toxic and poisonous situation as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So what you have in Iran is at the beginning of the century is an attempt to form a modern state with a constitutional um, monarchy, basically based on the British system at the time, in parliamentary democracy, and then a sort of an attempt over the next 50 years to put this into practice. And they get quite far along the route, but
Yeah.
just not far enough because a lot of the things that need to be done are aspects of the legal systems in the country, establishing it because you can have judges and penal codes and lawyers, the trouble is, if people don't think in the right way, I mean, this is the problem. If you don't have a sort of sense of, you know, what Montesquieu used to call virtue. So, I mean, if you, unless you operate the system in a, to call it a virtuous way,
Mm,
it's ultimately not going to, it's not going to work. And I think a number of the, one of the arguments about the development of the modern state was that, you have to develop the institutions, um, so that if you get a bad ruler, it constrains them. Do you know what I mean? I mean,
right,
so
right.
that, we all know that the possibility of getting a bad ruler is always there. It's fine when you've got a good ruler, by the way, it's not an issue. But the point is you've always got to plan for the fact that you get someone incompetent or stupid or
Yeah,
yeah. So what you need to do is you need to have the institutions in place to protect the body politic so that, that damage isn't done. And the problem in Iran is that those institutions were never really embedded. So,
right.
we got so far, then we have a revolution, which is sort of highlights some of the weaknesses. And with the Islamic Republic, you've seen attempts really in the first 20 years. There was an attempt to develop the idea of a republic, an Islamic republic, albeit but a republic. And then the second 20 years has basically seen the gradual dismantling of that whole notion. And we're almost like back to square one now. I mean, it's
Yeah,
always much easier, as you know, Paul, to sort of like destroy things rather than build things. So
yeah,
what might take 20 years to build might take a couple of years to just completely screw up. And that's basically what they've done. And they've done it with a huge amount of oil money, which has sort of disguised their ineptitude and allowed them to continue where they are. But it's been an utter fiasco. And now the chickens are coming home to roost.
yeah. It's
I
it's
mean,
Sorry, it's fascinating though when you're reading the book because as you said, it kind of people think the start of the revolution was 1979, but the kind of real start was like 1906, 1907. That kind of it's kind of edging in there. But as the change throughout the whole country from that time to now it's just
it
massive.
is
Like,
massive. I mean, you're absolutely right on that. I mean, when you look at it, and you see part of the problem, I think, of people who look at Iran, even Iranians who look at Iran, by the way,
hmm
is they're always looking at it from the I think the perspective of the future. They're not looking at it from the perspective of the people on the ground. So what they tend to do is they tend to look at, um, let's say, Iran in 1950 from the
hmm
perspective of Iran in 1980, not from the perspective of
right,
Iran, looking backwards and saying, where did they come from?
yeah,
Uh, Now, if you look at where they came from and what they had to start with to build the modern state, first of all, you're quite impressed by how much they got, how far they got. But also, I think you often have to sort of stand in awe in some ways. I mean, Iran is not unique in this respect. There are many sort of developing countries that, started from a very low bar, and had to get
hmm
up. But
hmm
still, nonetheless, you look at those sort of state builders in Iran, from 1906 through at least to, 1960s, maybe. I mean, if you look at them, and I'm not talking about the monarchy, by the way, I'm talking about those foot soldiers of the sort of technocrats, the bureaucrats, the engineers, the statesmen, whatever. They really did build something, and they transformed the country. And it's not unusual. It's not, when I say unusual, it's not surprising in some ways that this caused massive socioeconomic tensions.
hmm
And for many people, they found the transformation of their lives bewildering, you see.
hmm
And this is what I think the religious right in 1978, 79 exploited.
do you think that young people, because of the things like the internet, and they couldn't do it before, now can watch Iran from the 70s and watch pre the revolution and go, wow, that actually looks like fun. And that's why that's kind of, whether it was or not, but their idea of like, when you see the videos and
No,
there's
I
people
think
in
I think you're
miniskirts
absolutely. I
and,
see that. I think this is one of the fundamental differences of the current situation from say 40, 50 years ago.
hmm
So 40, 50 years ago, Khomeini was deemed to be very, very advanced, technologically advanced, because he used cassette tapes. I mean, he used cassette tapes to spread his message around, and
hmm
it was a way of getting the disseminating his message, and of course, it connected people in some way. But still, it's all quite channeled. You had to get people to go and get his tape recorded messages, get them around. They make copies. They send them.
yeah, yeah,
Now
yeah.
you've got this sort of global, this global village. And the interesting thing about this global village and the internet, and I think you're absolutely right on this. First of all, young people in Iran are finding ways to connect with the outside world in a way that their predecessors just couldn't do it. So they can connect with the outside world and they can see, I think, alternatives, right?
Yeah.
But then the other thing that you point out, which I think is absolutely right, is they also then have access, partly through the work of uh, all these Iranian television channels abroad who picked up a lot of this footage. What they do then is they watch a lot of films from the period of the Pahlavi period, the pre-revolutionary period. And of course, these are quite well curated. Let's not have any, they're sent to, not all of them, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, you get a limit and they're quite curated. And they say, oh, there was a time when women didn't have to wear the veil. Oh, and look, and the world didn't end. What
Mm.
was going on?
Mm.
I mean, these days, the mullahs are always saying, they said, if you don't wear a veil, I don't know, corruption will ensue, the world will collapse, all of the. So I was saying, well, I mean, it's complete nonsense because, I mean, we didn't wear the veil for, I mean, and the world didn't collapse. I mean,
Yeah.
but, they can see that and they can see visually what's going on.
Mm.
And I think it has a tremendous impact. I honestly think that without uh, uh, without this sort of footage going around and without the influence, that sort of nostalgia industry, if you can call it in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
um, some of the attitudes that you're getting among young people today, very bolshy, um, anti-regime,
Yeah.
quite pro-monarchy in their own way, to be honest.
And they're
I'm not sure they
knocking
really are
clerics.
pro-monarchy, but
They were knocking clerics' hats off. I seen videos of them
yeah,
running
yeah,
around.
yeah,
Not. I was like,
absolutely.
whoa, man!
Did you
Like
see
that's
that?
just.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That was incredible. You
I
know.
mean, I think the regime thought that it could put a lid on these protests and get the genie back in the bottle,
Okay.
and I think they're sorely mistaken, sorely
So
mistaken.
they're only kind of grown, really. They're just opening more people's minds to the idea. Do you think?
What
Young
the
people,
video?
sorry, the young, like through the protests. I think that as you were saying, like the Iranian government thought that they just quiet down and go back to the way normal, but
Well,
actually,
you see,
there's a
this is one of and this is one of the mistakes of successive Iranian governments, by the way, because let me put it this way: Iranian society can take a lot of pain.
Mhm.
Okay, it can put up with a lot. They're a very patient bunch, and they can put a lot of strain. And the trouble is what successive regimes, and the Shah's regime was just as guilty in some, but the Islamic Republic has taken the piss, to be honest, even more excessively. I
Mm.
mean, basically, their view is that they're so used to, in a sense, either popular apathy, complacency in some ways, but also the ability to, they sort of say Iranian society can never organize, it can never unite. We can always divide and rule. It's a modus operandi for them. So basically, the state itself becomes complacent,
Right.
and it sees no reason to change, and it basically takes things for granted. And I think the last year's protests and this year's election boycott have probably sent a very strong signal to them that those
Mm.
days are over. I mean,
Yeah.
the more I think about it, actually, when I look at the election protest that's happened, I do think in some ways it's a watershed moment because
Really.
it will send a message to the leadership that no amount of repression is going to work. I mean, I
Yeah.
mean, they could kill a lot more, to be honest, but what they thought is we'll pick out these ringleaders, we'll get them, imprisoned and executed. That'll sort it out. What's happened is it hasn't taken the
Mm.
wind out. It hasn't reduced the anger. People are annoyed, but this time the way that people have combated it has been in the classically Iranian way. They've just simply withdrawn their consent. Yeah. It's
Mm.
it's 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 a very, very interesting. I think what they did was extremely interesting,
Yeah.
and the question is how the regime will react to this.
How do you think they're going to react?
Well, I have to say, if they were sensible, they would acknowledge that something has gone badly wrong. But
Hmm.
I'll put money on it that they'll first bury their heads in the sands and say, well, I mean, this is the classic one. They'll say, well, 41% of people turned out is absolutely fine. And then they say it's absolutely fine because it's identical to what happened in 2021 for the presidential election. What they won't tell you, first of all, if you agree that that 41% figure is right, let's assume it's at least 5, 6% a bit bloated up. But what they're not telling you, and people on social media are saying, they're saying, yes, but of that 41%, 20% cast spoiled ballots.
Wow.
So, well, what do you say?
Jeez.
I mean, do you see what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
it's a complete, but they're still, what they're doing is they're doubling down on their own message. They're doubling down on their own sort of like, um, their own conviction. They're not prepared to believe that they've got it wrong yet. And I think it will hit the fan once you start to get a run in the currency. And the currency's starting to slip again, you see. So if you get a
Right.
run in the currency, they're going to be in a lot of trouble.
But isn't the only problem the supreme leader? That guy is never ever going to relinquish control. Like he is just an ideologue in the fact that he thinks he is right in everything. He will
No,
never.
absolutely, and he thinks he's basically infallible. And I think this is, as you say, you're quite right to say it's a real serious problem. But of course, he's ill. Um, I mean, interestingly enough, in this election, they made an absolute point of him walking to the ballot box unaided without a walking stick.
Oh,
He's always
okay,
had a walking stick. Now he's sort of like marched on to sort of say, I'm very
he's got
fit and
younger.
yeah, and but whether he's got a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. But I think, I mean, he's been through moments, and I think he's definitely ill. And there's all the talk of the succession at the moment.
Hmm.
And in any autocratic system, the most vulnerable time will be when will be when he dies, because the succession will be the big issue. And so the question is will the crisis happen while he's alive, or
Right.
will the crisis happen on his death? It's gonna it The crisis is going to happen. There is not going to be the sort of smooth succession that people think is going to happen.
Yeah. The dude's been like 40 years in charge when you think about it. Like, that's just a dictatorship kind of at this point, isn't it?
Well, when did he get in 1989? Yeah,
Nearly
30.
40. Nearly 40.
30.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
Like,
actually, we're in 2024, aren't we? Yeah,
yeah.
35.
Yeah. It's crazy. Like, it's
I
just,
know.
it's
And
mad.
he's
But
also a guy who hasn't really traveled, and he's not really seen much of the world. He's very, um, he's not, he's far from worldly wise.
yeah. Yeah. So, like, I seen videos of people just, there was a cleric and they were asking him about the riots on the streets of last year. This is probably from maybe 2 months ago. And he was saying, "Oh no, there was the only riots was there was people like trying to harm the police and stuff like that." And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
come on, man. And he said, "There's no unrest in Iran." He just would not give in. He goes, "It's the
Is it?
West.
Would he
It's the
not?
West. No, it's the West spreading the lies." He's like, "Did the
I
West
know.
tell you this?" Because it was like a Western reporter. I was like, "But that's what you do. You're just lying to those people." And it's like that whole like West narrative. And I think you could almost
Well, you
trace
get it. I
that
mean,
back.
there was a guy on the radio on the BBC who went on, and he's a sort of like a sometime academic,
Hmm.
and but he's basically a sort of a regime spokesperson in a sense.
Yeah, okay.
And he also came out. He actually came out with some. I don't know if you heard it as well, but he basically came out with the astonishing notion that no woman in Iran gets arrested for not wearing the veil. He said,
Oh, okay. All right.
which I thought, blimey, the laws changed overnight then.
That's news to me. Do
You
you
know
think?
what I
But
mean? But that's the thing. They said no. Everything that you say about Iran is all false. It's actually a perfect. It's an idyll. And I go, well, if it's an idyll, why are so many people trying to leave?
wow, like, you know what?
Why has Iran got the highest brain drain of any country in the world?
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
extraordinary.
As you were saying in the last chapter, the paranoid state, that they
Yeah.
actually believe, which I was like, whoa, is that true? That they actually believe that the kingdom of heaven on earth would be in Iran. Like, is that actually a
Well, yeah.
belief?
It's about basically the. I mean, I remember a long time ago. I was talking to an Ayatollah, and I said, how do you see the development of the human race? How do you see it?
Mm.
He said, well, there's a series of revolutions. Now, interestingly, this is a cleric, by the way. He said, the first great revolution, it was the French Revolution. That was, he said, 75% of the people, 25% leadership. Then there was the Russian Revolution, which was 50-50. And then there was our revolution, the Islamic Revolution, which was 75% leadership and 25% of the people, which was, yeah, all right. Now, notice, of course, that that genealogy is Western. Okay, I mean they're not. They won't talk about China and it's French, Russian, Iran.
Mm.
And he said the final revolutionary moment will be when the Imam Mahdi comes. The Messiah comes in, and that will be 100% leadership. There'll be no people. There'll be 100% leadership. And I said to him, I said, so where will the Imam Mahdi come? I mean, do you know when he'll come? When he'll come? And he said, no, no, nobody knows. So I said, what if he comes in America? What if you put it? And I mean, interestingly enough, he had to sort of say, he said, well, I mean, yeah, if it's not for us to choose. It's not a mortal choice. It's up to,
Right.
so he was sort of like, but you're absolutely right that, I mean, this was a long time ago. This is pre-Obama times, well,
Wow.
because Obama comes in, Barack Hussein Obama. I said, there you go. And then afterwards, of course, with Ahmadinejad and others, they're quite convinced, as you say, that, Iran is that sort of center of it's either Iran or Iraq. They're very sort of like fixated on somewhere. But you see, because they consider Iraq to really be an extension of Iran anyway,
Hmm.
that's the promised land. And the promised land will be there. The Messiah will come. It'll all be hunky-dory. It'll all be lovely. Um, Peace will reign upon, the world. Justice will come, and Iran will take its rightful place as the top nation, because we've always been the believers and the Shias. I mean, it's an extraordinary bit of codswallop. But it's for any of us who have read, and you'll be familiar with this sort of stuff. When you look at the nature of the Catholic Church in the past
Hmm.
and others, it's basically that. I think it's a means by which those with the religious authority pull the wool over the eyes of everyone else,
It's
and it's a way
control.
of keeping power.
Yeah.
One last effort. The promised land is round the corner. One last effort. And it's this joke, this sort of notion that we all live on different variations of what an academic scholar used to call the mosaic myth. That we get our emancipation, we're led through the desert for 40 years, and then we reach the promised land.
Yeah.
But what I was saying to people, I said that in Iran we've been wandering in the desert for rather longer than that now, and
Yeah.
we still don't know where the promised land is. And that's basically what they do there. They say, "Oh, one last push, and the promised land," and that's just a way of keeping people
Mm.
attentive.
Mm.
I mean,
There
you
is.
see this with politicians everywhere, Paul. I mean, I'm not saying,
Yeah.
but it's a political trope. But I mean, the revolutionary movements are particularly vulnerable to this sort of stuff. And of course, the more you suffer, in a sense, the more you're prepared to suffer. This is the irony of it. So the
Hmm.
more you suffer, the more people die. You think, oh, we've done so much. Let's keep going because it'd be a shame to jack it all in and admit we got it wrong. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The worst thing is to say, "Oh my God, we got it all wrong."
Yeah.
But that takes the bigger courage in some ways. Uh,
I
but
find.
no, they're just knuckling down, and they'll keep going and whatever. And eventually, at some stage, I suspect one of two things will happen: either the state will suffer an economic collapse,
Mhm.
or an economic crisis, which will then in turn engender a political crisis. My own sense is it will start with economics, although to be honest, as I was saying, the politics and economics of Iran are so tightly intertwined that
Right.
it's difficult to know what would be the catalyst. Do you see what I mean? It could be either.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
I
kind
always
of
think it's
like it.
better to. I'm very much in favor of the term political economy because I think one of the great weaknesses of our modern age is we talk about the economy as if it has no relation to politics.
Yeah. Yeah.
We talk in terms of statistics, but actually, the political economy, politics, is it's a vitally important component of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know what I know we're talking about Iran, but just the fact of the reigning government, there's only so long that the people will kind of take your shit. And I think that's happening in a lot of places. I mean, Ireland for sure, it's definitely happening. Like we never
Yeah.
had like riots. We never had people going out
I
doing
mean,
riots and
I
stuff like
must
that.
admit, I was quite surprised. I've always had this view. I mean, obviously, this is the way we all imagine, other places. We always see
Yeah,
there's an Emerald Isle, calm, a bit wet, but
it's
apart from
definitely
that,
wet.
everyone's very relaxed. Pint of Guinness, and that's about it, really. But yeah, I was really surprised to see on the television, as you say, these
Mm.
sort of like protests and riots and stuff. And it's really quite something.
Well, even like there's protests, and we'll say outside places where people have been housed. Which the problem with all that is, it's like, as I always say, you don't see Leo Varadkar walking down the road every day. They see
Mm.
the people who are in those places. So their anger that should be directed at the government goes towards those people, which is what the government kind of want, because then they can come back and say, you're just a bunch of, which they've done, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
they all, you're racist and you're this and you're that. And it's kind of like, there's only so long you can kind of start to erode people's culture where they're from, and like they're supposed to take it and stuff like that. Like even this was a guy on the TV channel the other day, and he was saying, "Well, Irish is kind of pointless," and I was like, "Nah, man, it's not pointless. I mean, it's might be to you, And he didn't actually say pointless, but he said he basically said it was no point. And then the host got up and shook his hand, agreeing with him. And there was an outrage kind of over this because of Irish speakers going, it is important. It's our language, it's our heritage, and it's that. And there's just that kind of thing of like, I find within the Irish government of like, there's no, even Micheál Martin came out and said there's no place for nationalism in Ireland. Now there's a difference between being nationalistic
Well,
and
patriotism. I mean, it's that
patriotism.
Orwellian distinction, isn't there,
Yeah,
between
yeah.
patriotism and nationalism? I do think, I mean, I had a talk with a colleague of mine here, and it was very interesting. We said, there's always, I mean, questions of identity. And it is funny, we're sort of obsessed with issues of identity these days,
Mhm.
any type of identity, but
Mhm.
not national identity.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that's and I tend to find, I mean, I find nationalism increasingly, and it's sort of a bit of an obnoxious sort of thing because it becomes it radically descends into stupidity. But if you look at it the other way and talk about community and identity and
Yeah.
patriotism and this that,
That's what I mean.
what's wrong with that? I mean,
Hmm.
what's wrong with that?
Yeah. But they're
We're
even.
all talking about community, and if you're talking about communities, then surely you have to sort of say, we need to maintain the integrity of the community.
Yeah.
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 I don't think there's anything wrong in saying that. I felt for a very long time, I'm an immigrant, and I came here when I was 10. I'm very familiar with British culture and English culture and others because I'd always been to schools but it took me a long time, to be honest, to become absorbed within the body politic.
Did
Not
you?
so much because people didn't absorb me, but I wanted to feel comfortable in it. Did you
Right.
see what I mean? I'd
Right.
come from a country, Iran, which has a very powerful national ethos. And, at the end of it, it was many years before I voted in this country.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I didn't feel it was right for me to vote in this country for many, many years.
Oh.
Um, I did occasionally, but right at the beginning, in the 1990s, I often didn't. Um, Not that there was a huge amount going on here in terms of voting, but you know what I mean. But
Yeah.
I didn't, when it's only actually after New Labour, after the Blair government, that I started voting, and I started then for. I mean, in some ways, actually, it was the Iraq War that triggered me a bit. Do you know?
Okay.
Yeah. And then I don't know, but I honestly think I often felt, and certainly when I came up to Scotland, I would vote in UK-wide elections. But for a long while, I never thought, I said, it's not really for me to vote in Scotland. I said, because I'm here from England and I don't feel that of course, big mistake, of course, because,
Yeah.
you know, then Scottish nationalists, got in and I suddenly thought, oh dear, this is really going to affect me. I need to start actually making my voice heard. But it's really in the noughties, sort of 2005 onwards, that I start to think about that. And I'm always amazed by people who come to another country and automatically think they should have they're automatically into everything that's possible. Um, and of course, one of the issues And it's fine. I don't have a problem myself. If that's how it works, and whatever. But
Hmm.
for me, always found it a bit awkward. I always found it
Right.
personally. I always found it a bit awkward. And navigating my two identities was always interesting. I mean, I've now settled very firmly into my British identity. I have no problem with it at all.
Would you
Um,
call yourself Iranian British or would you say you're British?
I'd say I'm British Iranian,
Okay. Okay.
and the reason I say that is because I use Iranian as my sort of, that's my heritage. I
Hmm.
can't deny it, and I'm
Hmm.
very proud of it. But my political identity and the adjective and the way is British.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean?
Okay.
My
Yeah.
my my ethnic identity. If you go on a form and they say, white Asian or white
Yeah.
other, or, you know what I mean? I mean, this is the beauty of census forms. They basically tell you what you are. It's funny because Asian in America means different to Asian here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, in America, Asian means Chinese, essentially.
Yeah.
But here, Asian means South Asian. It means Indian, really. Um, and they often say, uh, white British. I mean, some of the things they come out with are really quite peculiar. White English, white Scottish, white Welsh, white British, white. I mean, you always say there for fuck's sake. Just, you know what I mean? I mean, what? Just it's so many choices. So I normally say because they don't have a category for me actually, so I just say white other.
Okay.
Yeah, and but I've defined myself as I would define myself. I think I'm comfortable um, in British Iranian, where I make very clear that my political identity is British,
Right.
and a lot of my characteristics have come because I've lived here for so long, and whereas I don't want to deny the fact that my roots are and my ethnicity in that sense, if you want to look at it in that way, is obviously Iranian or Persian or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Um, and it forms part of who I am. I mean, I'm very comfortable with that. But I have no, my value system in a sense, I think is actually quite humanistic, actually.
Right.
And in that sense is sort of a product. When I read some of the ideas of the Enlightenment, not all of them, obviously. I mean, some of them are pretty bad, but the whole idea of rights and individual rights and the dignity of the individual and this sort of thing, these sort of things appeal to it. But you can see roots in Persian history that talk about these things, and I think there's a sort of an international value system which we share and belong. Albeit, the distinctions are also quite interesting because you'll be Irish, I'll be British Iranian or whatever, but there is also areas which I think there's a lot of convergence. You know, there'll be foods that, one day Paul will cook you a nice Persian meal and you'll see the
I've
bounties of
never had
Persian.
a Persian meal, so
But
I
that's what
look
I mean,
forward to it.
but there'll be sort of food that I love, which is Persian. I'm not
Right.
a great one for, I don't know, I mean, some of the German food you get in is sauerkraut and all this sort of thing. I'm
No,
not
I'm with you on
not
that.
so keen on that. But on the other hand, there will be many aspects, I think, of our cultural heritage jointly, which we share actually, because we share it being part of an inheritance of Western Europe
Hmm.
and Britain for that matter of fact, really. I mean, there's a sort of an inheritance there. Your parliamentary system, your things. These are all things that even when you go to America, I mean, there are things that I share with Americans. There are things that I don't share with Americans. But there are things that I do share with Americans that you can see as part of a common political, heritage. You know,
You know what's funny when you say about America? Every time I say it to my girlfriend in America, she goes, "No, no, no." Do you know? Because she's from Brazil, so she goes, "The
ah,
United
yeah, the
States of
United
America."
States, yeah.
But I always do it.
That's very. You see, that's also very interesting, isn't it? Because you're right. We sort of talk about America,
Yeah, and we mean the
but
states.
yeah, what we mean is the States.
Yeah, we always
I mean,
do.
I,
Like,
I, I love it because I have lots of Canadian friends, and the
oh
Canadians are
right,
great, and the Canadians are wonderful, because
yeah,
they're very funny, because it's like, particularly the old school Canadians who are basically very, very British in their sort of outlook in many ways. And although, unless you're from Quebec, where they're very, but nonetheless, I mean, it's interesting. You talk about Americas, and they go, which America are you talking about? I mean, it's
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's funny talk about Canada. I did, DNA test, to get your ethnicity
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thing,
yeah.
and I'm 1% Inuit.
Are you?
Yeah,
Crikey.
and you could trace it
That's
back.
interesting. I wonder where that came from.
it's up Canada area, but I don't know how.
Yeah.
I don't know how. I used to always tell my parents when I was younger. I'd be like, you know, I'm Native American, jokingly, and then when it turns out I'm 1% Inuit, I was like, close or kind of close.
I wonder whether you have, I mean, somewhere down I mean, it's 1%, isn't it? So it's not that, but somewhere down the line, someone must have
Yeah,
either traveled to, um,
yeah,
got into a bit of a tussle somewhere,
yeah,
perhaps,
yeah. Durable relationship, maybe.
Yeah, durable relationship. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Who
Yeah, it was quite
knows?
interesting.
I'd
I
love to do one of these myself, actually. I'd be fascinated to see what I suspect quite a bit of mine will probably be sort of Caucasian and Russian, actually, but I don't know. Who
Yeah, I
knows?
had
You know,
a lot
these
of
ethnic
Celts.
these identities are all very accidental, aren't they? I mean, they're not, they're all accidents of history in some ways.
Yeah, yeah. My brother, of course, said to me, he goes, I'm 2% Inuit. I said, Adrian, how can you be 2% if I'm 1%? He goes, no, I'm 2%. And his girlfriend in the background, you're 1%. Oh, yeah, I'm 1%. I was like, yeah, you couldn't be just 2%. I mean,
I
go, hey,
know, I know.
ma'am, what were you at? Like, you know what I mean? But it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. Actually, before I let you go, I actually want to ask you a
Yeah,
question. Just one more question.
sure.
Where do you see Europe going? Like,
Wow.
Europe
Now
seems
there's a
weird.
good, I mean,
I
that's,
know that's a
I think that
loaded
should
question.
segue into our next podcast. I personally think Europe has, and by Europe, do you mean the EU effectively?
Yeah, because I think I'm not going to use the term woke.
I think Europe is now confronting many of the problems that Britain and America have recognized, if not yet solved, but certainly recognized for many, many years. And
Hmm.
I think the Europeans, and to some extent the Irish, by the way, and what you're witnessing in Ireland today, I
Hmm.
think it's a recognition that the situation is not quite as rosy as you thought it might be. But if you look at what's going on in Holland, what might happen in France in the next election, what's happening in a number of European countries is that there are a lot of tensions coming from precisely the sort of things that we discussed. There's a sort of a there's a pan transnational movement that's trying to basically homogenize everything. And
Yes.
this forced homogenization is creating a lot of frictions among people who are really frantically trying to maintain a sort of a distinct sense of their own identity. But also, I think there are other political economy problems that are emerging.
Hmm.
You know, people always say about Europe that there are now three EUs: Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, and Southern Europe.
Mm.
Southern Europe is having it quite tough. Eastern
Mm.
Europe, interestingly, is picking up because of the Ukraine war. There's a lot of sort of attention and investment and focus on them.
Yeah.
Poland is now emerging into a bit of a powerhouse in terms
Poland's
of its
crazy.
military importance. But it's interesting. I think the Franco-German axis is probably going to get weaker, and partly because I mean, there's two things that are quite interesting actually. That someone was, in fact, there was a piece in the Economist about this, which I found quite interesting. That one is that there's and they're sort of interrelated. So one of the consequences of Britain leaving the EU is that many smaller countries in the EU have lost their protector. And what do I mean by that? I
Right.
mean that um, Britain always used to balance Franco-German dominance by saying, off you go, Estonia, we're behind you. You know what I mean? I mean, because Britain couldn't break into that Franco-German alliance, so basically
Uh-huh.
balance that playing field by bringing in smaller, and that's part of the reason why the British encouraged the expansion of Europe, you see, of course, which has had all sorts of unforeseen consequences, obviously. Um, so that's one of the things that's failed now. So many of the smaller states are no longer, if Europe is going to function properly in the future, you simply can't. I mean, how many states are there in you? Was it 35 or something? I can't remember now. It's a lot.
Keeps growing.
Yeah, it's going to be quite difficult to manage as this sort of like Tower of Babel, that's
Hmm.
carrying on. So one of the arguments is that now you need to tighten up the organization so it's much more streamlined. It's one of the reasons why the British left, I think, by the way, it's because they were fearful of that. Or certainly those who wanted to leave.
Yeah.
And I think, there is going to be a certain amount of friction emerging between some of the smaller states and I think a Franco-German core who's going to want to try and drive things, and because of the
Mm.
size, they're important. But my own view is that Europe, in a very basic way, has to reform, or it's going to fail. I mean, it has to reform itself in a meaningful way, and I just don't know what the answer to that is.
Hmm.
Um, in a very just to give you an idea, for me, the euro, great idea, the euro, but unless you sort out your fiscal, you know, a sort of what's the word? It's not fiscal unity. What is it? Fiscal. Anyway, I'll figure. I know that we have obviously in Britain where you have that sort of um, the exchange of
Policy,
money
is
and
it your
the
fiscal policy?
fiscal unification.
Hmm.
Um, Europe doesn't have it.
Right.
Europe doesn't have it. We do transfer bits of money, but Ireland is a net contributor to the EU now.
Yeah.
Quite something really, Ireland.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a fake
so
economy, though. We have it's a completely fake. Like our GDP
well,
rose.
as you
Our,
say, because of the yeah, because as you
our
say, because
GDP rose I think 25% in one year, but that was actually because of Apple. Apple were
I know.
registering all
Well,
these
that was
things.
the thing, and
You
of course
know.
they always use the Irish figures. They say,
Yeah.
"Look, the emerald, the tiger, the Irish tiger." So I said, "Hang on a minute, this is all." It's a bit like saying in Iran, "Oh my God, look, the GDP rose by 30%." I said, "Yeah, yes, because the oil price has gone up by
Exactly.
150." I mean, do you know what I mean? That's
Yeah.
basically.
Exactly. So it's a big bubble just came there. Oh, it's a thumbs up,
I
I
know.
think.
What was that? I put my thumb up and it suddenly came up. What was that? Very weird.
That was mad.
I
Yeah,
don't know
but
what
it's
that
like,
is.
yeah, yeah. Do you know? I read it.
No,
There's
so I think it's uh I think they're going to have to find a way to reform the system in a way so that at the moment the political economy of the European Union serves essentially Germany and its hinterland.
oh yeah,
And it's just not going to work in the long run. It's
no,
just not.
no, no. And I think what the Europe's has this kind of ego about it that Europe is such a great country, or not country, such a great continent that when people come here that are culturally different than us, of course they're going to assimilate and they want to because we're this arrogance about it, and that has not happened in many places, and
Yeah.
that's why whether people want to admit it or not, that's why the far right or more right policies are gaining traction in Europe because there's this sense of people's identity in Europe are kind of being changed through things like that.
Well, this is the problem when you have a sort of a impersonal bureaucracy dictating policies,
Hmm.
which people feel they don't have much control over.
Hmm.
Populists will take advantage of it.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a big mistake, actually.
yeah.
In governance terms, it's a big mistake. And I see personally, I see it as replete with problems. And we saw it ourselves, in the way that populists took advantage of the whole Brexit argument,
Yeah.
in this country. But
Ah, well,
it's when people feel impotent and they think they're being dictated to by a vast impersonal bureaucracy, they'll react to it in different ways.
well, even in a smaller way, Galloway is the perfect
Yeah, yeah,
populist. Do
absolutely,
you know what I mean?
absolutely perfect. Yeah,
You know,
perfect example.
like how many
Perfect.
places has he been? Bethnal Green, he's been.
Fourth, this is his fourth constituency.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see, we'll see.
But
Well,
anyway, I am gonna have to sadly depart because I
that's
do have
okay,
to go to
Ali.
another
Well, thank you
lecture
very
in
much,
about 15
and
minutes.
I loved your lovely book. I'm just going to plug that
Thank you
again
so
for you.
much, and thank you for having me. And do read it again, Paul. You know you
I,
want
I,
to.
I will. There's a lot in it. I have to. I'm not very intelligent, so I need to. I
No,
need
no, not at all.
to.
I'm still promising that we're going to come and visit you in person at some point.
Do,
So I will go.
do. All right, brother.
We
We
can, then
will.
we can do a podcast actually in person.
That
Can
would
you
be
imagine?
cool. That would be
Yeah.
cool. The state of Europe might be a good podcast. That might
I
take.
know we could
That
do
might be
something
too
like that.
long though. Might be too long.
I know. I don't know if anyone. I don't know if anyone will listen to us, Paul. But anyway,
Who cares? Who cares? Right, Ali.
all right.
Thanks, brother.
Take care. Thanks for everything.
Cheers. Talk soon. Bye bye.
Bye.